today's book review, we're going to look at The Magnolia Story by Chip and Joanna Gaines. If you're unfamiliar with the Gaineses, they're business people from Waco, Texas, who starred on the show Fixer Upper on HGTV, now run Magnolia Market, as well as a bakery, a cafe, a real estate venture, as well as starting their very own television network. So the book is written in first person from both Joanna's and Chip's perspective, and they use the fonts to kind of separate the two voices. What I like about the format is that it gives a very unique and very personal perspective on how Magnolia came to be what it is today. Knowing this, I had 3 key takeaways from the book that I'd like to share with you. The first takeaway I had from the book is how we are raised contributes to who we are. Both Chip and Joanna were raised by families that really loved them and cared about their outcomes in life. Joanna's parents ran a local Firestone tire in Waco, and while Joanna's father was hoping that one of his kids would take over the business, he was encouraging of Joanna in pursuing her own passions. Meanwhile, Chip was raised with a very entrepreneurial spirit. From a very young age, he was finding new businesses and figuring his way through making money. At the same time, both of them were raised with family values and a faith in God that contributed to their success in business, as well as the way that they raise their kids today. But I think it's important to note at this point that they were two very different people. Joanna grew up being very cautious, very methodical, thinking things through, and Chip often was more trusting and more willing to try things out, even if they failed. That largely contrasting dynamic is what led the television producers of Fixer Upper to pick them up as one of their candidates for a show. This leads me to my second takeaway from the book, which is don't settle for comfort. In Joanna's retelling of first meeting Chip and then getting to know him, later dating and getting married, she's always described her relationship to Chip as being full of surprises. Chip famously bought a houseboat without telling Joanna as a rehab project and surprised her with it, putting her in absolute shock at not only the fact that he had put down so much for the property, but that they would have to figure out a way to rehab it and resell it. Now, it wasn't entirely out of the blue because Chip had been flipping houses for some time, but it was unexpected and it was a total curveball in Joanna's mind. And that's kind of been the cycle of life over the course of their marriage. Chip often viewed houses as just properties, as just ways of doing business, and Joanna had often invested the time to really make those houses home. And every time that Chip would find a new property to buy, as they moved from the first house to the second house to the third house, they eventually came upon a house that Joanna really loved. She grew quite comfortable in that house, and the prospect of moving to another house seemed a little out there, a little scary. But by trusting God with the outcome, they were eventually able to move into a house that has become their dream house. And this leads me to my third takeaway from the book, which is to trust God with your dreams. As mentioned earlier, both Chip and Joanna were raised in Christian homes. But what I find really interesting is that the way they took on their own faith. Earlier on in life, while Joanna was at Baylor University, she took an internship to New York City. And in New York, she discovered a love of the New York boutiques, which sold all sorts of paraphernalia in these lovely stores. The inspiration from those stores is what would ultimately lead to her opening up Magnolia in Waco, Texas. It was originally founded in a small store in downtown Waco. And the story of opening that first store is just as interesting as the story of the larger store today. While Chip and Joanna were working on fixing and flipping several houses in Waco, they came across the storefront in downtown. As the story tells, it was by the grace of God that the owner was willing to sell the property to Chip and Joanna for the purpose of making the Magnolia Store. And when the store opened, although slow at first, grew traction quite quickly as people all over Waco discovered this store that reminded them of the boutiques in New York. It was a profitable store, people loved the merchandise and the way it was laid out. It could have existed like it was for a long time. But at a certain point, Joanna felt like the Spirit of God told her that it was time to close the shop. And that was about the time that the fix and flip business was really taking off. And while it might have seemed out of touch logically, Joanna trusted that God's purpose and plan for this was bigger than she could imagine. So they closed doors on the shop, and Joanna was able to devote more attention towards helping Chip with the fix and flip business. Eventually, that arm of their business needed more office space, and the market had been sitting empty for a while, and that wound up being their office for a time. Now, the story could have ended there. They could have just continued on with a successful real estate business. But once again, Joanna describes that she heard the voice of God again, that it was time to open the store again. And somewhere down the road in that whole process, the owner of the silos that everyone now knows as the Magnolia Silos District, their owner was selling the property, but didn't want to sell it to someone who would tear down the silos. Now, Chip and Joanna really loved the silos. Joanna especially loved the way that they kind of stood out in the downtown landscape and wanted to preserve them as a part and a backdrop not only of the store, but also as Waco of a whole. And once again, by the grace of God, they wound up with the property where they are today. And since the time of writing this book, they've expanded on the property tenfold, from moving in an old church to founding various different stores there, to adding a Magnolia cafe and a cupcake shop. Magnolia has really blossomed, and I think both Chip and Joanna would attribute that to trusting God with their dreams. All that to say, I think it's a great book. It's worthwhile to pick up and read for anyone who's interested in learning more about their story. It gave a very high-level view of what was going on and may have missed some details or mashed them together in my head. So for the whole story, be sure to check out the book on your own. But with that said, that's the end of the video. If you liked it, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video. Totally.